Black Earth offers a full suite of humic solutions, from high-purity granules to powder, liquid, and soluble formulations, all powered by pure humulite. Trusted by growers worldwide from one of the world's rarest humulite reserves. Grow stronger with the power of Black Earth humulite. Learn more from mine to market by visiting blackearth.com.
Let's talk markets here on this Wednesday. We're joined by Arlan Suderman with StoneX. Hey, Arlan, how are we doing?
We're doing well. It's been a busy 6 months. Hard to believe 2025 is halfway over already.
And okay, wait, hey, okay, well, yeah, I'm with you. It finally feels like summer here in parts of Western Canada. We could use a little bit more moisture for sure. What's been the biggest surprise for you from a market standpoint in the first 6 months?
I think how resilient the economy has been overall, and that's the underlying economy. There's certainly been a lot of turbulence, a lot of uncertainty. But when we look at some of the economic numbers for the United States, we're looking at a stock market setting record highs over the past week with all the uncertainty. And we know the business is holding back. Just look at some of the employment numbers. They're holding back hiring because of the uncertainty of the tariff situation, the uncertainty of whether we're going to see the tax cuts of 2017 expire at the end of the year. Consumers are holding back for the same reason. Yet the economy as a whole is fairly resilient right now and still hanging on. That's probably the biggest surprise.
Yeah, still, obviously there are some tariffs that have been put in place, but we haven't seen the full implementation. Of course, there's a deadline here coming up here within the next week on that, I guess, that second wave of or that pushback on the deadline with all the different countries. President Trump has said that he will not budge on that. At least that's what he said on Friday. We haven't seen inflation really pick up. It's been pretty moderate, but there is concern about the job market, though.
Yeah, with all the headlines about inflation, we really saw the consumer pull back in April. We've had a little bit of a bounce in consumer confidence. Consumer spending goes with consumer sentiment. And so you would think, well, based on the consumer surveys, they were expecting year ahead inflation to be at 7% initially. That's pulled back a little bit now, but overall, that's not what you generally get from tariffs because the consumer has X amount of disposable income. And so while some products go up, others that are produced domestically do not. And so they tend to, if they have to spend more for what they want that's imported with tariff, they spend less for others. Now, that's slows the economy down, but it doesn't give you the big jump of inflation that people fear or expect. It does give you a slowdown in the economy. So we really haven't seen, I do think we will see a little bit more of a rise in inflation going forward, but not to the levels that were initially feared.
Yeah, one of the things that all the tariff talk has definitely had an impact on is that U.S. dollar. Definitely has shown some weakness. What implications does that have on ag commodity exports?
Our biggest problem in exporting ag commodities, particularly corn and soybeans, has not been, and even wheat, has not been the tariffs. It has been the dollar and currencies of our competing countries and those countries that buy. And specifically, Brazil has taken market share away from the United States in corn and soybeans big time. And if you go back and track, you can find that relationship from when the Brazilian real began to weaken right around 2011 or so. That's when they started accelerating their expansion of area planted, destroying more acres, mostly brushland. I know some rainforest was destroyed as well. That's a separate issue. But mostly the millions and millions and millions of acres of brushland that they have that can be converted to cropland and continue to have to expand. And as long as that currency in Brazil is weak relative to the dollar, they're going to do it. And as long as that's the case, then when China and other customers go to buy, currency exchange rates are going to make that cheaper to buy than what it is from the United States. So the weaker U.S. dollar does help us be able to compete more in the commodity market.
Now, one of the challenges, though, if the Fed starts to cut rates in the back half here of 25, does that weaken that U.S. dollar index even further?
It does relative to what's happening in other countries, most specifically Europe. Can the euro actually sustain a rally. If it can, then the dollar can go lower, the U.S. dollar. So it comes down to how good a job Europe does with its economy. And of course, a big part of that is tied to the tariff war there as well and how that plays out. But in order for the U.S. dollar to go weaker, we need to have the euro be able to strengthen.
What do you see happening here with this deadline on tariffs with countries like obviously with the EU, with Japan, obviously Canada's in that mix. We saw big news on Canada on Friday, but
Yeah.
what do you think we're going to see the full implementation of tariffs, or what do you think is going to be the outcome?
I think it'll be mixed. I was getting some optimism from Europe that there seemed to be some determination to reach an agreement, but the differences between Europe and the United States are still very stark. But again, that's part of the negotiation process. If you're negotiating effectively, you're holding a hard line right up until the deadline to see which party is that deadline more important to. And you're using that deadline. It's kind of like the game of football. You're using the sideline to your advantage. Though the sideline here is that expiration date, so to speak. And so both sides are going to look like they're far apart until the 11th hour. But I do think Europe and the United States are still very far apart, very values driven there. I'm a little bit more optimistic now about progress with Canada and being able to agree agreement with Canada. I think we'll have an agreement with Mexico. I keep hearing talk about good progress with India, and I think we probably will. Japan probably as well. South Korea could be a problem with the change in the government overall. So I think there will be some countries that sign agreements. There will be those who we do not. And President Trump will say, we've made sufficient progress. We'll give them an extension. They're negotiating in good faith. And there will be others that say they're not negotiating in good faith. We're just going to raise the tariffs on them. And so it'll be a mixture.
Yeah, I guess what are we at the end of the day, Arlan? What's being negotiated? Like it's being communicated from the White House as a deal. But in some cases, there's comprehensive trade agreements already in place with countries like Canada, or there was a major deal done with Japan in the first Trump administration that yielded some really good numbers for the U.S. So what is this? A framework? How would you describe it?
Well, first of all, we have to go back and say normally presidents negotiate trade deals with fast track authority from Congress that allows them to negotiate a deal, and then Congress can only give an up or down vote on it. It cannot amend it in any way, which really complicates the matters when you have a committee of 435 people trying to negotiate a trade deal. Fast track authority has been renewed constantly until we got to the Biden administration where it was allowed to expire. Biden didn't even ask for it to be extended. So President Trump doesn't have fast track authority. So he can't get a trade deal through this Congress. There's no way he can. So what he's basically done is saying, I'm using my authority under the Emergency Powers Act to put a tariff on you to get you to change what you do. And if you change what you do, we'll lift the tariffs that we have on you. And so his goal is to overall reduce tariffs and reduce non-tariff restrictions, which if everybody would go down to zero tariffs and zero trade restrictions, you'd probably have global economic growth at a tremendous pace. But even President Trump has his areas that he wants to protect for national security reasons, what he deems. The steel and aluminum, which is a big issue between the United States and Canada. He sees that as a national security issue. So he's not going to negotiate those tariffs all the way down to zero. He's going to have some baseline level he's willing to negotiate them down to. He likes the revenue generated by tariffs. So what level is that? Is that 5%, 10%, 4%? We don't know what that is. That will be in there at some point. But in the end, since these are not congressionally approved agreements, when President Trump leaves office, they could all go out the window unless the next president is going to use the same emphasis and force in order to keep them in play.
Yeah, I guess. Well, there's not just the trade deals, but there's a lot. With the high use of executive orders that we've seen from the past number of administrations,
Yes.
there's a lot
Yes.
that fall into that web for sure. Hey, big news at the end of last week. USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins talking about, I guess, a tempered reopening of Mexican cattle coming into the U.S. What impact does that have on the markets here?
Feeder cattle market collapsed because that announcement came at a time when speculative funds essentially had record long positions in the feeder cattle market and very large positions in the fat cattle market. I think we saw an overreaction overall because I think the flow of cattle, and mind you, at one point, feeder cattle moving across the border north into the United States was nearly 30,000 per week, 30,000 head per week. It's been zero now for quite some time. So we're going to start seeing a trickle to start with. The question is, how quickly does that increase? And I think the market overreacted because I think it's initially going to be slow. But Secretary Rollins has shown some flexibility here to work with Mexico. And Mexico, I think Mexico's president has done an outstanding job of working with this administration, handled it very well. And so if she continues to be happy with what Mexico is doing, that trickle flow could increase to a much faster flow. That's what the market's reacting to. I think we'll see a comeback something in between. We still have tight protein supplies in the United States. And with all I've said about consumer sentiment and consumer confidence and consumer spending, the consumer is still spending on beef. They're spending more money on beef and pork and poultry this year than they did a year ago. And I'm not just talking about money spent. I'm talking about volume of meat consumed. Latest data we have showed 5% increase in volume of beef, the highest priced meat, versus a year before. So the consumer is still buying, but we don't have the animals here.
Arlan, how though? Like that's the head scratcher, right? We talk about the impact on the housing market with where consumers are consumers' willingness to invest. We look at what's going on in the auto sector, but beef, it just seems to be this anomaly where people just spend regardless. How is it just doesn't? It seems to defy economics.
Inelastic is what we call it in economics. Price doesn't negatively impact demand, and it seems to be because of all the emphasis on protein-based diets in the United States, and particularly among the younger generation, they want their protein, and price doesn't matter, even if they have to cut other things in their life.
Yeah. Hey, want to finish up with crops. We had the USDA report on Monday. Crop conditions out as well. This crop is off to a pretty decent start. What gets in front of it? Provide some analysis here.
Well, I think the 4th of July holiday weekend is a big one that typically is the one where traders come back from that holiday and they look at the weather models that look 15 days out. That takes them past the midway point of pollination. If that 15-day outlook continues to be favorable with moderate temperatures and periodic showers, then they're going to assume an above trend yield and ending stocks above 2 billion bushels, and we'll likely see a lot of selling. If, in fact, it flips and we actually see the hot, dry risks that have been in the 16 to 45-day outlook for the past 2.5 months move forward into the 2-week outlook, then it'll be buy all the corn and soybeans that they can. And so that'll be a very pivotal time, I think, this week coming out of this weekend for both corn and soybeans. Soybeans are hanging on a little bit better now because it's looking like we're going to have a strong biofuel program. Exports are still a question. But with the reduced area planted to soybeans this year, we're still very vulnerable to weather, and the weather risks for that are late July and August. So we have more time, so the fund's not quite ready to short the soybeans.
Hey, last question. You mentioned biofuels. How critical is it that we have EPA and in this budget reconciliation bill, this talk of domestic feedstocks being North American feedstocks? Obviously, that's a play against a product coming in from China. But looking at this biofuel feedstock market as being North American, how critical is that?
Oh, I think it's very critical overall for being able to hit the objectives because we will increase crush dramatically of soybeans here in the States, but we have limited capacity. And so I think the canola is going to be an essential part of that, along with some of the other feedstocks, but keeping out the used cooking oil, which is probably palm oil with a French fry thrown into it to make it test for used cooking oil coming from China, I think it is critical to support agriculture in North America. And I think it shows the spirit of cooperation that we see in Congress between the United States and Canada. Hopefully that spirit will spread.
Hey, great stuff. Hey, Arlan, thanks a lot for joining us here today.
Thank you, Shaun.
For the latest ag news, agronomic advice, and more, check out realagriculture.com and RealAg Radio.